Hello everyone, I'm Luke from Luke Reads. You can follow my Instagram page, which is dedicated to reading and literature, both in English and in Maltese. And today, as part of the Malta Mediterranean Literature Festival, I have John Carson with me, and we will be having a conversation about her books and literature in general. A bit of a background information about Jan. She has recently won the EU Prize for Literature for her novel, The Fire Starters, which is a very good read, and we'll be exploring some of the themes and the writing behind the novel together. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, Luke. It's lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too. Okay, so I wanted to start off by talking about the fire starters, especially the inspiration behind the novel and sort of what drove you to write such a novel.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things. I live in East Belfast, the part of the city that the novel is set in, and I'm a tremendously nosy person. So a lot of it came from observing my neighbours and the people who live around me. And particularly, I've been a community arts facilitator here in Belfast for about 20 years. So one of the characters, Sammy, there's two main characters in the novel, and Sammy is an older man who is an ex-paramilitary, and his character really came from a lot of the men that I've worked with in community arts projects over the years. So I've always known I wanted to write something about that. And I guess this is my second novel, my fourth book. I've shied away very much from writing directly about Northern Irish politics, but you can't be from Northern Ireland and get away without writing about politics for too long.
I'm hitting so many questions with your answer at the moment, because these are some of the questions that I would like to ask you as well.
Yeah.
I have to admit that the character profiles of the two men, Sammy and Dr. Jonathan, are really great character profiles. I mean, the detail and the intricacies of their personality traits, at least in that span that the novel deals with, is so great. So you must have a really good eye for people and for observing people and personality traits. Did you just inspire yourself from watching people, or do you think your reading has affected the way that these men were shaped, or did you research, I don't know, did you look into the fields of psychology, for instance, for inspiration? How did you go about that?
I guess with Sammy, it was mostly drawn from watching the people around me and trying to not just focus in on one person, but create a kind of composite of lots of different people. I would never lift someone from real life and just put them into fiction, but I will draw little bits from different people and create a character. Jonathan, for me, is probably the closest character I've ever written to myself. So even though he's a man, sometimes if you change a character's gender, the person it's based on doesn't recognise themselves. It's a wee writer's trick there. But he's struggling with a background where he's been quite repressed as a child. For Jonathan, it's that he's had parents who didn't love him. For me, I grew up in a very religious household. It was, a lot of rules and a lot of things that you couldn't do. And so moving into adulthood, I had to learn how to be social and how to interact and how to be a bit freer with myself. And I channeled a lot of that into Jonathan. You can see it quite clearly. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned psychology as well. I haven't read up on psychology, but there's a real question of that nature versus nurture theme that runs through both men's stories, and it's something that's fascinated me. I love books like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and books that explore that kind of dualism in people, that they can be both things at the same time.
So do you think that this nature versus nurture issue, was it accidental to a certain extent, or was it something that you set out to include when you started writing the novel?
I'll let you in on a secret. Look, I never set out to try and do anything. It's always afterwards. And most writers, if they're being honest, I think are the same. Yeah. We have a vague idea that we want to tell a story. Then you write it, and then you look at it and you think, oh gosh, what important political themes have I touched on? And what will make me sound really intelligent if I say I was trying to explore binary natures in psychology or something? But I do think it's there under the surface of, as you write, I'm a furious reader. I read about 300 books a year, and I watch a lot of movies, and I'm very lucky that I have lots of people in my life I have great conversations with, and I'm absolutely certain that that burrows into your psyche and comes out when you write, whether you intend it to or not.
Definitely, and as you have said, you pick up, different traits from different people, and I guess then the creative in you merges them into their own individual character and sort of give them life, as it were.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, good. What I was intrigued about is the use of magic realism in the novel. Personally, I'm not a big fan of magic realism because I find it very hard to read for some reason. But I really, really enjoyed the touch of it in the fire starters, mainly because there's a siren, and coming from a Mediterranean country, I love the water, and I'm always fascinated by the sea. So maybe that there was a connection there. What drove you to use magic realism in this novel?
I guess I have to be honest from the start. I'm always a magic realist, so 90% of my work would be magic realist, and I didn't know I was a magic realist. I began writing in a kind of vacuum, so I didn't start writing in a community of writers or come out of a creative writing program. I just wrote instinctively, and what came out was magic realism. And then I had a good friend, the poet Sinead Morrissey. She pressed a copy of Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum into my hand and said, "That's what you are, you're a magic realist." So it was nice to know there was a name for the madness. For me, in a Northern Irish context, magic realism allows me a bit of a buffer, a space to be honest about the difficult things that have happened in our culture and our history, and not confront them head on. I'm always drawn to the big political magic realist writers, Salman Rushdie, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Gunter Grass, and their use of symbol and allegory and metaphor. It always packed a punch, and it was always engaging with the kind of social issues and the politics of the places they were from. And quite often it said things that would have been very difficult to say in a straightforward manner. I'm very lucky. I wrote the fire starters about 5 years ago. 25 years ago, I could have been put on a paramilitary hit list for writing something like this. I'm from a culture where saying things obliquely can be quite dangerous. So to hide behind the metaphors and the symbols is a really useful trope for me.
Do you think magic realism has a place in our society nowadays? As in, a lot of people sort of look down at times at magic realism, or they think it's not literature, as in with a capital L. How do you feel about this? As in, obviously, now that I know that you're a magic realist writer, I think you feel strongly about this.
Yeah, I guess I also understand as well. I don't like fantasy. I'm not a big fan of fantasy writing. There's a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, no. I prefer realism myself, but I think magic realism can do something that realism can't do. My biggest hero writer, she's unfortunately dead, but I really love Flannery O'Connor's work. And Flannery O'Connor was asked why she used the grotesque in her writing. So as a Southern Gothic writer, she often used these grotesque, really horrible images and plot lines, and she said this, which I'm going to horribly paraphrase, that she said, for the hard of hearing you shout, and for the blind you use large and startling images. And this idea that there are stories and issues that have been told so many times in a straight up realist manner, we've become desensitized to it. And so something like a siren or a flying child stops you in your tracks and makes you ask, what does that mean? And what does it mean to me? And what does it mean to the culture I find myself in? I think that's where magic realism, absurdism, fantasy, the grotesque, whatever you need to use to get that message across. I even think about horror, like that, something like the novel Let the Right One In. I'm not sure if you've read it, about vampires. But I mean, it says a lot about paedophilia. which is a really difficult topic to talk about, honestly. But the image of the vampire becomes really interesting in that context. So that's why I'm always reluctant to say, oh, this is genre fiction. I think that can be incredibly dismissive. And also, I mean, some of the best books in the world, and, you know, given that title by people who know their stuff, things like Midnight's Children and The Tin Drum, they're magic realism. You know, you would never argue that Midnight's Children isn't an example of really quality literature. It's high literary fiction, but it's also magic realism.
Definitely. I definitely agree.
Sorry, that's my wee sermon on magic realism.
Okay. No, I think that's a great answer. And no, obviously, I think I do understand that sometimes, even as in, I consider myself to be quite an avid reader, but sometimes you need to have the story told to you in a different way, you know, because sometimes the story is just the same and you need a different method in which the story could be conveyed. And actually, to link with this, what I particularly liked about the Firestarters is the use of setting. I think setting is used so masterfully in the novel. And you've already mentioned that you come from East Belfast yourself. So can you tell me a little bit about your decision behind setting the novel in East Belfast and the importance of setting in your work, in this novel, and in your work in general?
Yeah, setting is a huge thing for me. For me to write a book, I have to feel a kind of connection to the place. So it's quite interesting. My first novel was set in Portland in Oregon, even though I was living back in Belfast at the time. I had been living there for 4 years and then lost my work visa and reluctantly came here. So I basically wrote where my heart was. And you can mirror the kind of process of me falling in love with Belfast in my literature. So my early stories were set in America, and then they were set in some undefined other place, and then they were set in a very generic Northern Ireland, and they've come closer and closer and closer to, mostly now I either write about East Belfast or I write about the rural community that I grew up in. And because, you know, to me, I have to write from a place of knowing what I'm writing about, and these are the landscapes I know best. With the Firestarters, there was a real physical process to the writing as well. It's a street novel. It's set in, you know, if you ever have the blessing of coming to East Belfast, you'll see it's a very close community. It was built very quickly over a period of about 10 to 15 years to provide housing for the men who were working in the shipyards. So the houses went out very quickly. They're terrace streets. They're close together. This was the era before cars. So my front door opens onto the street and my back door opens onto a back alley, and my neighbours are on either side. And so when I wrote the Firestarters, I situated myself very much in that claustrophobic environment of East Belfast. And for me, that meant listening to my neighbours a lot and watching what was going on outside, but also pounding the streets. So I walked and walked and walked and walked with a notebook in my pocket and staring at people and stopping at the bus stop to scribble, because you have to stop in a bus stop in Belfast. It's always raining. You need a bit of cover to write anywhere. And I think the book came out on foot. It's a little bit scary at the minute because my next book is literally set on a boat in Belfast Lough. So I'm trying to work out how I can get myself out there to write. A little more difficult, but this is definitely a book that was written on the street.
Okay. Very interesting. I've never been to Belfast myself, but I felt like while I was reading, it became very familiar, and you know, it felt as if it were another character in the novel. And I think it is so important also because of the political aspects that you try to raise, I think, as well in the novel, which we will discuss in a short time. Shall we do a bit of reading? What do you think?
Yeah, actually, I was going to read one of the more magic realist parts, but I might read a little bit of description of Belfast, just to give people an idea of it, seeing as we've been talking about Belfast for the last wee while. I'm going to read a couple of pages from the section which is just before the bonfire season starts, where it's summer in the city, and you get this sense of the kind of claustrophobia of the streets. I'm only going to read one page, I think, but you get a sense of these tiny little streets. And in the summer here, I mean, we only get about 1 week of summer when it doesn't rain, but when it does, people go mad for it. They come out in their bikinis and they pull their living room furniture out into the street, and there's a real sense of community. So hopefully you'll get that in this. It is summer in the city now. Not yet high summer, but hot enough to leave the local lads bare-chested, their backs, bellies and shoulders already pinking to the colour of cooked ham slices. It is a World Cup summer. The people here are particularly fond of football because it is a game of two sides and involves kicking. The sound of televised crowds can be heard grumbling through the open windows of every other house in the east. Drink has been taken. More drink will be taken. In the morning, the smell of it will be like a damp cloth in a closed room. Overhead, a helicopter hovers. It's a sort of insect humming. Its blades turn the hot air this way and that. It is barely moving. The women, who are mostly indifferent to sport, have dragged dining room chairs into the street. They sit in front of their houses like fat Buddhas watching the traffic idle. Sometimes they call to each other across the road. Good to see the weather back, or I hear it's to turn at the weekend. Sometimes they duck into their little kitchens, returning with fizzy drinks in glasses and tins. Before drinking, they press the coldness against their foreheads for a minute and sigh. Afterwards, the flesh is pink as if it has been burnt. The deep V of their breasts is also pink and turning red. By 10 o'clock it will smart like nettle stings, but they do not for a minute consider sunscreen. Sun cream is only for holidays abroad. The local sun is weaker. It is less inclined to provoke cancer than the continental sun. Every woman on the street is determined to be brown by September. They wear their skirts hoiked above the knee, revealing splayed thighs and varicose veins, winter fur, and occasionally the fine laced ghost of a petticoat hem. They are their mothers and their grandmothers before them. They have been guarding these streets in similar fashion since the shipyards demanded houses. 100 terraced streets rose in response, and this became known as the Glorious East.
Your reading is so fascinating. Well done for that. I love the sense of community, as you mentioned, that comes through this passage. I mean, it evokes, I think, coming from a Mediterranean island and coming from an island where at least in the past, we were very community-based in the sense that, we knew what our neighbors were up to, we had the old ladies looking out from the windows and peeping and having a look at what is happening. And even though, it was mainly for gossiping reasons, but there was always a sense of community, especially in the village cores, which unfortunately is being lost because our architectural landscape in Malta is changing drastically as well. And I loved hearing that passage now because it reminded me of my childhood when I used to be friends with all of my neighbors' children, and we used to go out and play in the streets. And the sense of community that everyone was there and present is something that I think youth today are losing, at least in a lot of places.
Yeah, it's changing here as well. There's been a lot of gentrification in the East. And then we've had some other lovely new attempts at community. So at the end of my